Hey guys, today I'm talking about starting tomatoes from seeds. As you can see, all these tomatoes on the table were started from seed, and I'm going to go over the 20 most common mistakes people make and how to correct each one of those mistakes when growing beautiful tomatoes like this monster right here. So one of the most common mistakes people make when selecting what seed they're going to grow into tomatoes is growing the wrong tomato variety for your zone or your climate. Not only can you have zones, but you can have microclimates within the zone. So just remember, you want to do a little bit of research. It would be nearly impossible to make a video that talked about each zone that you could possibly grow tomatoes in. So do a little bit of research. If you have super short summers, then you're obviously going to want a tomato that goes from seed to harvest very quickly. So just remember, you want to do that little bit of research on what tomato grows best in your zone. Now, the next mistake that people make is using very, very old seeds. And when I say old, I'm talking about over 10 years, because it's been proven that tomatoes are still viable up to 10 years, and in some cases 12 years to possibly even 13 years. But when you get into the 14 to 16 year range, those seeds are probably not going to work. But it's an amazing fact that seeds can last for over 10 years, but then you kind of run into the viability issue dropping very quickly once you get past 12 years. So just remember, when I say old seeds, I'm talking about incredibly old seeds that may have been stored away somewhere, and maybe even on a store shelf in a store that doesn't sell a lot of seeds. You want to make sure that those seeds are not in excess of 12 years old, which is kind of rare, but it does happen sometimes. Now, my area gets a lot of humidity in summer, and it's incredibly humid in July, August, and September. And so ignoring disease-resistant varieties is another mistake people often make. You want to make sure that if you do have humidity issues or excessive rain like the Pacific Northwest, you want to make sure that they're going to be resistant to disease. So do a little bit of research and find out the best tomato variety that is resistant to seed in your area. That's a tremendous mistake to make if you spend a lot of time growing it and then all of your tomato plants die from various diseases that are common in your zone or your climate. Now, the next mistake people often make is using heavy garden soil or a non-sterile potting mix. You want to use a sterile seed starting mix to make sure that there's no diseases in the soil. And so that is a very, very important rule to remember, that your starting seeds, it needs to be in a disease-free potting mix, maybe even vermiculite or perlite, something that's going to have absolutely no disease in it that you can quickly transfer to a larger container with a regular potting mix. So just remember, sterile is the way to go in the beginning. Now, when you are using this, you might use something like an individual container, a plastic cup, or even a seed starting tray. You just want to remember, you don't want to plant it too deep. 1/4 of an inch is plenty enough, and in some cases, even less than that. So just remember, seeds need to be shallow rather than deep. Now, the next most common thing that people do, they will put too many seeds in a small container or a seed starting tray. In each cell or each cup, you want to have maybe maximum of 3 to 4 seeds, possibly 1 to 2 if they have a high germination rate. So you just don't want to have overcrowding in that seed starting area, because that will cause disease and competition for nutrients, and your tomato plants will suffer in the long term if you do put too many into each container, cell, cup, whatever you're using. Now, the next set of mistakes that people most commonly make is insufficient light. And if you're having your seeds starting in an area that's too dark and doesn't have enough light, your seedlings can become leggy and tall, and that's a problem. So remember, you want to make sure they're in an area that has sufficient light, but not too much light. Excessive sunlight will damage the seedlings as they grow initially. So a grow light or a window that's not south facing can really help. So just remember, lighting is key, but not too much light. Keep them out of the windows that are in direct south facing windows. So a final note on those seedlings that you do have growing near a window: you can acclimate them to direct sunlight, but you need to do that over a period of 1 to 2 weeks in just a few hours a day. So just remember, that's a process that you do to get your seedlings acclimated to more bright sunlight. And remember, only an hour or 2 at the most if it's a sunny facing window. If you're growing them under grow lights, then that may not be as big of a problem, but you don't want the grow lights just sitting right on top of the seedlings, because it can provide too much sunlight. So maybe just allow a little bit of distance between that and your grow lights, and you want to make sure that you're reading the type of grow light you have as far as strength, and you want to make sure that it's not going to be too much for your seedlings. So just a bright light can be enough. Maybe just a regular fluorescent light can be enough to get your seedlings off to a good start. Now, another problem that can happen with your seedlings is incorrect soil temperature. You want between 70 and 80 degrees. You can monitor it with a soil pH meter that also has a temperature meter built into it. I'll put the link down below to this one. But that's another thing. You just want to make sure that your soil temperature is not extremely warm or extremely cold below 70 degrees, because it's going to slow the germination rate and be less productive for your tomato seedling. So just remember that 70 to 80 Fahrenheit, or I believe it's 20 to 27 Celsius, is going to be ideal to get your seedlings off to a good start from seed. Now, the next set of mistakes that happen when it comes to seedlings is incorrect watering practices. Overwatering can lead to root rot, and that's one thing you need to look out for. You're not trying to keep a large plant alive, so overwatering is not going to be necessary. Just very light watering will keep the soil moist. Using a meter like this will tell you if your soil is wet or waterlogged, and that can cause disease if it is waterlogged. So just remember, depending on the depth, these are a little bit deeper. If I'm using a seed tray, obviously it's only going to be a couple of inches deep. But just remember that top 1 inch, you can use your finger. If you don't have a pH meter and a moisture meter, just use your finger to test the top 1 inch of soil to make sure that it's damp but not waterlogged. Now, another thing that a lot of people don't take into consideration is the temperature of the water they're using. Using extremely cold water can shock the plant. You want to use room temperature water. I've got a large container that I keep in the greenhouse that stays about room temperature. I wouldn't use the rain catch barrel that I have outside to water seedlings, because that water would be too cold. So just remember, set your water container inside so it can come to about room temperature in a garage, greenhouse, storage building, so that way the water is not extremely cold. It's not sitting outside in the early springtime where the water temperature at night can really drop and then you don't realize it, but as you water your seedlings, you're actually going to send them into shock by having the water temperature far too low. Now, the next set of problems that people often do incorrectly when it comes to tomato seedlings is over-fertilization. You want to wait till your second set of true leaves develop, and then that's when you can fertilize. But you want to use a balanced fertilizer that's been diluted to 50%. So full strength is probably going to be too much for some very, very new and weak seedlings. Now, when speaking of fertilizing too early, some people wait too late to fertilize, and they ignore signs of deficiencies in the plant, such as yellowing leaves, wilting, and things like that, discoloration. So you want to make sure that you do fertilize and monitor your tomato plants and make sure there's no signs of a nutrient deficiency, and then make sure you water appropriately with a liquid-based fertilizer or a slow-release fertilizer, making sure that you don't over-fertilize by cutting that recommended rate by 50%. Now, the next set of mistakes people often make is the transplanting too early. Transplanting is something that needs to be done very carefully, because if you take it outside too soon, it can be a shock. So without acclimation, the plants will go into shock because of the really colder nighttime temperatures if you're doing this in early spring, or in some places even early summer. So just remember, you want to do this slowly in a few hours a day by allowing them to have a little bit of outdoor temperatures, but waiting until they've established themselves and become a little bit hardened off, so you can take them outside and leave them overnight when the temperatures are still slightly cold, of course not freezing, which would obviously kill any tomato plant. Another mistake people often make is by delaying their transplanting. If they're growing in something like a seed starting tray, it can become root bound. Now, these are all pretty larger size pots, and they can stay in here for quite a long time, and they have been in here for a long time. But if you're starting in a seed starting tray, then you're going to want to make sure you get them out of there before they have a chance to become root bound. After about 2 to 3 sets of true leaves, then move it into a larger container, something like these cups or small 4-inch pots, or directly into the ground if your nighttime temperatures are correct and you have acclimated them to the temperatures over a period of 7 to 10 days. Now, I mentioned starting the seeds too close together in their seed starting trays or pots and putting too many seeds in there. The same rule applies when taking them out to the garden. Depending on the space of each plant, its final size during the midsummer and end summer, you want to make sure that you're not putting them too close together. So just remember, you want to allow them to have adequate room by doing a little bit of research on each variety that you're planting, and making sure that once the final size is reached, that they're not too crowded, not competing for nutrients, water, and shading each other, by making sure they're nicely spaced apart. That's just the point I'm trying to get across, is you want to know their final size. As if you were planting a tree, you wouldn't want to plant trees too close together, because they're going to grow into each other and they're going to hinder the growth of the tree. And if there's a fruit producing tree, then obviously you're going to have less fruit, and the same goes for tomatoes. Now, soil preparation is the next mistake that people fail to do. You want to make sure that you amend the soil properly so that it's really good quality soil. My soil here is almost all clay, and so I have to do soil amendments. I've got a couple of videos I made. One is about a vermicomposter where you take worms, kitchen scraps, and you create your own very high quality soil. I'll link that up above. And also just a standard composter, and both of these are done very cheaper. The standard composter, I'll link that up above too. So you can really amend your soil and have your tomatoes off to an incredible head start, and you'll end up tomatoes with this size right here. Now, the next mistake that people often make when it comes to their soil and not preparing the proper soil pH is not testing their pH. You can test it. These pH monitors now are so inexpensive. They're less than $25, and if you get it at a discount, it could be less than $20. So remember to test your pH before you put your tomatoes into that area and add amendments if necessary. The ideal pH for tomatoes is around 6.2 to 6.8, so they like it on the acidic side. So just remember, amendments can make a huge difference in your soil. Now, another soil issue that I have in my yard is I have extremely heavy clay soils. The soils are just like that everywhere in my yard, unless it's under a large tree that's been there for a long time and it's naturally been amended by the leaves that have fallen over the decades. But just remember that you want to make sure that if you do have heavy clay soils, that you amend it properly and mix it into that heavy clay. If you have sand and it's draining too fast, it could be the complete opposite problem, that it drains too quickly and the root system doesn't get enough moisture, and you're going to need to do amendments whether it's too much clay or too much sand. So very few people have perfect soil. Maybe in the Northwest, I've heard they have some of the best soil in the entire United States. So depending on what part of the world you're in, you want to make sure that your soil doesn't drain too quickly or doesn't drain at all. A good way to test it on heavy clay soil is to dig a hole in the ground, fill it with water, and if it's not completely drained in under 15 minutes, your soil is probably going to hold too much water, and there's going to be issues with waterlogging, and it's going to cause diseases. So just remember, amendments are so important when it comes to soil. Now, the next set of mistakes that people make is not providing support for their tomato plants. Even if you have the bush variety, which grows into a smaller, more compact form that can stand on its own, if you have a sudden windstorm that comes through and it's got a lot of heavy fruit on it, tomatoes, it's going to blow over and break it at the stem, and you've lost your entire tomato plant. So make sure you use cages, trellises, supporting wires, whatever you can use to make sure that wind and rain don't knock your tomato plant off. Especially vining and indeterminate types, they're going to continue to grow and grow and grow. So you absolutely have to use trellising, and there's some new types on the market I really like that I haven't tried yet that allow you to grow indeterminate varieties just on and on and on. I'll make a video about that in the next couple of months since we're getting so close to the growing season, and it'll show you exactly how to use those. I've did a lot of research on them. I've always used cages and hard trellises, and I'm going to try something new this summer to see if I can make my tomatoes grow even better with a new type of trellis I've come across. So the next issue in relation to supporting your tomato plants is not doing it at the proper time. When you plant your tomato in the ground, that's the best time to have your trellises, cage, whatever you're using already in place, so you won't have to come back later and think, uh-oh, I've got to put this on the tomato plant. It's gotten too big. You're going to break off branches. So at the time you plant your tomato seedling in the ground, have your support system in place so they don't have to be added later on and cause problems for the plant. Now, the next mistake that people make when they are using different types of trellises is they're tying too tightly around the stem by not using a loose-fitting tie. And if they use string, sometimes that can cut into the plant as it works its way back in the natural breezes and things like that. And so that can cause damage to the plant and cause a large section of it to die off. So just remember, you want the type of ties, you want them to be adjustable and it's not choking the plant and killing the vine portion, especially in the indeterminate varieties that are going to keep growing, and there's going to be that more chance of swaying and moving in light breezes or even in heavy storms. So just remember, you want something that doesn't completely bind into the vine and kill your plant. So the next set of mistakes that people make when it comes to their tomato plants is over pruning or pruning incorrectly. You want to make sure that you don't aggressively prune in the initial stages once you have it planted. Allow some growth to happen so it doesn't weaken the plant. If you are pruning early on, just make sure that you only focus on pruning damaged limbs or diseased limbs of your tomato plant, whether they were killed by disease or frost or even birds or other natural things like that. Don't do too much pruning initially. Allow the plant to get some growth on it and some strength, energy from the plant directed down to the root system so that it's ready to be pruned at a later time. Now, another mistake that when it comes to pruning that people often make is failing to prune the suckers off of the elbows of the plants or the individual stems. You'll see a sucker come out of this area here. You need to break that off, and as with this, it's been started in water from a sucker and it's developed into its own individual plant. So just remember that ignoring the suckers as they develop can pull energy away from the areas where your plant's going to produce the most fruit. So just make sure you remove those suckers, and if you want to, you can start a whole new tomato plant in something like water or use a rooting hormone in a sterile mix. Now, some of the next problems that develop with your seedlings can be pest problems, and failing to do proper pest management is another thing that can cause problems with your tomato plants. If you fail to look under the underside of leaves and check closely for infestations, maybe even using something like a magnifying glass where you can see if there's some aphids or other issues, spider mites. So just remember, use things that are organic like neem oil and insecticidal soap rather than using harsh synthetic pesticides that are going to end up in your tomatoes, and that's something you probably don't ever want to do, is use synthetic on something you're going to eat that has harsh chemicals in it. So just remember, those organic route is the best way to go. I'll make a link right here that shows you how to make your own homemade pest control solutions for aphids, spider mites, and things like that. So the next set of problems that people often encounter is disease and failure to do crop rotation within their garden. Leaving your plants in the same spot every year and regrowing and regrowing and regrowing, you can run into a problem with diseases building up into the soil. So do some crop rotation and put your tomatoes in a different spot, bring something else into that spot, and just try to do that. If you're using buckets and growing in containers, you want to refresh that soil, pour that soil into your compost bin, and then put in some fresh soil. I've got a video that tells you exactly how to make your own high quality soil that'll save you a lot of money. I'll put that link right here. So the next set of problems you're going to have with your tomato plants is fungal diseases. If you plant them too close together, you want to make sure you allow good airflow. Maybe stagger your plantings like this, one here, one here, one here, one here, to allow airflow to move between the plants. If you plant them all in a row, it may prevent some good airflow. So staggering the plants like that can allow more airflow and prevent fungal diseases. The next disease-causing issue, it can be when you're watering too much on the foliage and not at the base of the plant. I prefer to water all of my vegetable plants with micro irrigation. I have an entire system that I put into the garden, but if you don't have an entire system, you can use it, a hose-in system that's got a timer on it, and it'll put just the right amount of water at the base of each plant. But watering the overall on top of your plant can be a mistake because it can cause diseases, especially depending on the time of day. If you're doing it late in the evening, that can cause a lot of diseases. So if you are watering with a hose, make sure you only water at the base of the plant and don't put a lot of water all over the entire plant and the foliage of the plant. Now, the next set of mistakes that people often make with seedlings is failure to mulch. Once it goes out into the garden, my spring and summer can be extremely wet or it can be extremely dry. But if it gets too dry, then obviously your tomato seedlings are not going to perform well. So just remember, provide a good layer of mulch. I use something called soil conditioner from a local hardware store near me. It's a national hardware store in the United States, but the bag will read soil conditioner. Is very, very fine pine bark that's shredded to maybe 1/4 inch size, and it will degrade and decompose rather quickly. I used to use a larger shredded pine bark, and it just took years and years for it to decompose. So I prefer the soil conditioner. It's in a very large bag, and I put it around each plant. Keep a space open about 2 inches at the base of each plant. You don't want to smother the base and have it where it can't have a little bit of breathing area there. So just remember, keep that 2-inch diameter around the stem of each tomato plant or seedling open ground, and just allow that water to get into that spot quite easily. Now, the next problem is improper fertilization. If you're using a high nitrogen fertilizer during the flowering or fruiting, that's a mistake because it's going to put more energy into leaf production rather than fruit production. You want something with a high NPK number. The N is nitrogen. You want that to be low. You want your phosphorus to be quite high, and you want to have a good amount of potassium to prevent any blossom end rot. And I've got a way to make your own preventative stuff that'll put more calcium and phosphorus into the soil. I'll link that up above. It's an eggshell mixture, and it's really easy to make. As long as you save your eggshells, you can make it indefinitely, and it's basically free. Now, Sunscald and not providing shade for your tomato plants or your tomato seedlings early on, if you've started them a little bit later and it's beginning to become the summer months, Sunscald can definitely damage small seedlings if you started late in the year. So just remember, you want to provide some shade fabric and prevent that, especially if you're in zone 8, 9, or 10. Sometimes I can get away with that here in zone 7A, but I know in some of the zones higher than mine, there's going to be an issue with Sunscald if you don't provide them some midday shade. Now, another mistake that people often make when they're harvesting their fruits is they either collect them too soon or too late. You want to collect them, harvest them when they are fully formed like this and they have good solid color, but they're still firm. So just remember, if you harvest too late, they're going to be too soft and they're going to rotten rather quickly. Now, the next mistake that people often make, and I've done this myself, is failure to clean up the garden at the end of the season. You want to put your tomato plants into the compost bin, because if you just allow them to remain on the top of the soil, that's going to create diseases. I've got a video where I actually took some eggplants and did a very ancient method of putting them in the ground, and they kind of compost themselves right there in the bed. So I'll put a link to that video as well. But if you don't do that, then you need to build you a compost bin that you can take your tomato plants and get them out of the garden and do an overall cleanup and prepare the soil for next year, so you don't have the problem of diseases. And remember to always do the crop rotation to prevent any disease buildup that might be in the soil already. So guys, I hope all of these tips will help you get your tomato seedlings and your seeds off to a really good start all the way to harvest. If I left anything out, if you'll leave a comment down below. But in any case, I really appreciate you watching, and I hope you'll like and subscribe if you found something helpful. Have a great day.